Well, I listened to the thing from last week and it was considerably better than the one from the week before. I was actually pretty interested. I don't know if I was right, but it was interesting. Um, when you start talking about the sixties, man, it's just, it's a different thing. The century, the decades afterward were kind of a letdown in terms of, maybe that's a good thing. I mean, you can't sustain that kind of, I don't know what it is from the sixties, but everything changed. And so we're going to continue talking about the consequences of that. You know, a lot of people, people ask, well, when did this happen? This postmodern loss of faith? And a lot of people think it actually started in the 1800s with writers like Friedrich Nietzsche from Germany. He would have been considered a postmodern writer as well. Anytime there's this, what do you want to call it? Subversion. Well, there's this idea, I was going to say anytime you see the subversion of the gatekeepers, you're talking about postmodern, but postmodern is the subversion of the modernist gatekeepers, right? So you had the pre-modern gatekeepers, which was the church. Then you had the modern gatekeepers, which were the secularists. And their victory lap was taken with Darwin as they kind of, what do you call it, consolidated their victories in public institutions around the world from the late 1800s on until the 1960s. And secularism was ruling the day as far as the gatekeepers were concerned.
What are the gatekeepers?
They're the people that decide what is true for us.
Oh,
They are the ones who decide what is real for us and what we are supposed to believe about the world. And so they were pretty effective. I mean, Darwinism took the world by storm. But it turns out that at the populist level, there's always been a lot of doubt. And today we're really seeing that resurgence. In the early 2000s, there was this movement, which I've talked about, called the New Atheists, which was a movement of secularists. It might be the modernists' last hurrah, where they were going to, take back, they were going to eliminate, I don't know how you do that without violence, faith. That faith was the great subversion of modern civilization, and that once you eliminate faith, religion, superstition, and so forth, that a brave new world breaks out. I don't know, but that was a spectacular failure, and that might have been the last hurrah for modernity. Postmodernity is a subset, is the offspring of modernity. So we're all modern, and all the postmodernists are also modern, children of modernity as well. But postmodernists have subverted modernity. That idea that rationality, humanist rationality, is the way forward. And we can be optimistic because we can build a better world through technological advancement and better institutions and democracy, for that matter. That's modernity right there. Even the love affair with democracy. So we tried that thing in the 90s. We were going to spread democracy around the world. That's modernity, and it didn't work at all.
What's the definition of modernity?
That I just said it. That secular drive for rationality and humanism, that you're going to rebuild public institutions along secular lines and eliminate religion. That's modernity.
Is the root word modern?
Yes. So you can move from pre-modern, which is a religious mindset and a religious narrative about the world. Let's go there. We kind of got behind on this thing that I spent a lot of time on. So we move from pre-modernity, which has a religious narrative about the world. We tell ourselves a religious story about the world. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, where the Bible goes unquestioned. Then the Enlightenment comes, and the gatekeeping changes. And over time, there's this wholesale replacement of this religious gatekeeping with a secular modern gatekeeping. And the religious side retreats into the private sphere. But the prevailing narrative is kind of both. There's lots of, you still had prayer in schools early, the Pledge of Allegiance references God, it's still there. So it's kind of that both narratives, the religious and the modern secular narrative about the world. It's a Darwinian, outwardly facing, it's Darwinian, but there's this religious undertone because people, well, maybe not all the way, God still created the world and so on and so forth. But that's the modern, rational, secular, scientific, technological gatekeeping. And it was very optimistic until the early 1900s with the outbreak of World War I, when it just came apart at the seams. And by the time we come out of World War II, this period from 1911 through 1945, well, not even then because of the nuclear age, this is a period of instability. And you maintain, you got the League of Nations, so you're still trying to maintain some kind of optimism about things. But it's not really working. League of Nations fails. The 30s ends up, everybody's optimistic that something better can happen out of World War I when we get into the Roaring 20s. Then the Great Depression hits. That sets everybody back. Then World War II hits, which was a consequence of World War I. Direct causal link between World War I and World War II. Had there not been a World War I, there probably would not have been a World War II. Had the United States supported Germany in World War I, there may not have been a World War II. All kinds of funky things happen that end up in movies when you play with the historical timeline. I'm not saying that the US should have supported Germany. I'm just saying you move the pieces a little bit and you don't really know what would have happened. We come out of World War II and we have the instability of the nuclear age. And now you have a bipolar world, Soviet Union, communism versus the West, NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, the United States versus the Soviet Union, Cold War, all of those kinds of things, which also feeds into the 60s. And then in the 60s, of course, we have the radicalism that exploded, and along with that, second wave feminism. But here in this postmodern period that I'm going to start, postmodern loss of faith really makes its presence known in the culture in the 60s. Did I start I don't remember doing this today. I don't remember doing things that I did 4 seconds ago, like start the recording.
What does it mean when it says science discredited?
Yes. So what happened in modern era? Science was ascendant. You can watch these movies from the 50s, and the scientist is the new priest. He's the new high priest. What the scientist says goes. He's the authority. Even today with COVID, remember the phrase about science? What did they say about science during COVID? Trust the science. The science is settled. Trust the science. If you don't, you're a heretic. Almost religious. Trust the science. Of course, the reason you should trust the science at that time was because the science was to our advantage. When the science is not to our advantage, like with regard to, say, gender, those exact same people call science something else.
You said almost religious. I removed the word almost.
Yep. I was giving him a small benefit of the doubt, but so that's what I mean. Science in the postmodern era, that's the loss of faith. They were supposed to give us all these tools to make a better world, and what they really gave us was weapons of mass destruction and wars and a newly unstable world, a newly destabilized world from nuclear weapons, where all you're doing is counting on the prudence of people on both sides and mutually assured destruction. Think about a phrase like that. That's what you're counting on to prevent a nuclear war. That both sides are going to realize that, well, if we do this, it'll be mutually assured destruction. We'll both be destroyed. The game worked. So anyway, that's what I mean by discredited. The prevailing narrative then in the beginning in the 60s with this loss of faith, this postmodern suspicion and so forth, was a loss of faith, a subversion of all narratives. We don't tell ourselves any stories about origins or you know, the way the world ought to be. It's a retreat inward. So we don't have a story. We're just kind of lost people on the planet. We're, you know, that's our lot. And so the result of that then is fragmentation from the family on up. That will change too in the next group you'll see above, but let's just walk through the rest. So personal identity, superficial. We move from created in God's image, even during the modern era, even in the movies of the 50s, if you watch these things. They're scientists and they talk about, you know, science, but they believe in God. It's still there. Like Descartes, he was an example of that, or a whole bunch of Isaac Newton, so forth. Although Isaac Newton was pious. But anyway, superficial, fragile, in flux. Nothing is guaranteed about, you know, you can't quite get your feet with who you are. Lots of movies and books are written about that. People trying to find themselves. And for some reason, when you needed to find yourself, you ended up in New York. Like New York is the place to find yourself. In the case of Rambo, he went to Tibet or something. Where did he go? Some monastery to the top of a mountain, you know.
I'm thinking these gatekeepers and these scientists that are pushing away from the one true God could fall in the category of the false prophets that the Bible talks about. Would that be true? Probably.
Yeah, but it's false that everything they say is false. There's no God in it.
Right.
So, you know, just ignore them on the question of God and evolution. And a lot of the scientists are fine. You don't need to know anything about evolution to do really good biology or paleontology or archaeology or any of the other ologies. You don't need to believe in evolution to do any of that stuff. I don't know exactly what an evolutionary biologist is. Maybe I should ask Kristen Davis emailed me this morning a little bit. I asked her a question. We'll talk about that in a minute, a little bit later, but I should ask her, what's the difference between an evolutionary biologist and a biologist? What's the word evolutionary doing in front of the word biologist? How does it change your biology? Go ahead.
They're specifically studying the change species to species, like what makes the difference between one species to one other species, like trying to find one. Yeah. Not specifically the link, just what makes it the difference. Like say you've got a bunch of cats that live on an island for a long time. Eventually they are going to be different from the cats on the mainland, but they're going to be considered something different.
But I can study all of that without knowing anything about evolution.
They specialize it. It's like having a cancer doctor versus a skin cancer doctor. One specified.
Sounds like storytelling to me.
Okay.
And I guess I'll believe your story or not. I mean, you know, okay. That's a good story. That's a compelling story, not yours.
So it does happen. Eventually, those cats won't be able to make babies with the cats.
Correct, yeah.
There is a difference eventually.
Yeah, that's a biological question. But the evolutionary part is some imaginary tree above it that resulted in this, which is all, in my view, storytelling.
Basically, what they're doing is they're looking at adaptation and microevolution.
Yeah.
Trying to make it evolution.
Yeah, so I don't know. I take the point, yeah.
They're studying God's truth without giving God credit for his truth.
That's Romans chapter 1.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a prophetic chapter.
And they're discovering God's truth.
And then denying it.
Yeah, denying that God did it.
Yeah.
And so God turns them over to something else.
That's right.
Yeah.
And oh boy.
Keeps
Yeah.
turning them over. The futility of their minds.
So we'll talk about, when we get to today, we got 3 weeks counting today. When we get to this day, current year, we'll talk about the morality. Every one of these periods has a prevailing moral sense about it, a prevailing morality. And when you change somebody's moral system, their prevailing morality, you change them and you change the culture. And the people, these postmodernists and fourth wave, third wave feminists and so forth, they're onto that. If you redefine what a culture thinks of as right and wrong, what constitutes the culture's sins, what's considered heresy versus orthodoxy, you've transformed the culture. And they're onto that, and that's exactly what they do. And so they control the narrative on the moral system of the country, or at least they did till about a few months ago, and we'll see where it goes from today. But back to the postmodern side, starting in the sixties, post-World War II, pessimistic, there's it's gonna become a pseudo-spiritual kind of thing, almost a worship of the self. We'll talk about that. Anti-scientific loss of faith. And that's gonna start for the anti-scientific part a little bit later, but that's gonna all kick into gear and get forward momentum in the sixties
What's Anthony?
against science. Science becomes an enemy unless science is saying what you want
An enemy to who?
to their philosophy of life, to the moral framework and philosophy of life that they're advocating and the way of understanding the world. If the science doesn't support that, if what the scientists say doesn't support that, they then call the scientists racist. That's anti-scientific. That's what I mean by anti-scientific. And so that's going to kick in as well. And then you have names that you make up for these kinds of things, which are, the names of sins. You just make up names, name calling, essentially. That's for today. That's what's going on today. So that's the postmodern period, which we're in the middle of. We're in this transit with, all of these are now, there's all folding together one period after another. Morality is now personal, subjective, relative, relativistic, dynamic. It's changing. It's in flux for each individual. When you have your truths and I have my truths, and isn't it great that we can all have our own truths? Who are you to tell me what's right and wrong? In the 90s, that's what you'd hear from college students. When I was on staff at Crusade, I talked to thousands of college students. And you would hear that all the time. It's just wonderful that we all have her. That's my truth.
Yeah.
And then what happens is reality now begins to enter that kind of subjective realm as well. Reality depends on how you see it. What's real is a matter of interpretation. And once you get into that, we can't even have an argument because we're seeing two different realities. That has exploded in our time. How else do you explain this transgender thing? There are people walking around with my sense of reality is so far removed from the sense of reality of some other people out there that it's like we're not even in the same universe. That's how different it is. We'll talk about it's privatistic. It's been personalized. Yes, but it's worse than that. It's been personalized. Truth, reason, morality, reality have now all been personalized. I define what those things are. I define what's real for me. I define what's moral. I have no outside guides. No higher power tells me what's right and wrong and true or not true. It's the wholesale, the subversion of authority started with modernity because they subverted the church. Now they let the cat out of the bag. So now in this day and age, it's the subversion of all authority. And all authority then becomes racist or homophobic or sexist or something like that. That's what we've devolved into now. So nobody's allowed to tell anybody what's true, moral, real, none of that stuff. That's the world that we live in today. And it began to unravel into that in the 60s with this postmodern loss of faith.
So are you giving those as examples of relativism?
That's all of course, that's all relativism. All of that is relativism. I'm going one step further and saying it's personalizing it as well.
Those are examples. Now what's the definition?
I don't know. A lot of times you get the definition from the examples, right?
Yeah, but my mind is a little slow sometimes.
Deny claims this is Wikipedia, absolute objectivity within a particular domain and assert that value is relative to the perspective of the observer or the context or something like that. That's relevant. I take that. That's good enough for me.
I'm trying to get I'm getting it now. If the root words relate, so
Needless to say, we're gonna talk about the Anglican Church in a minute, if we get there. All right, God then is viewed as we see him today in this world with the current gatekeepers, or let's go back to before the second Tuesday of November 2024. Let's go back to that world. No, all the way back to the 60s. We'll go all the way back to the 60s. God then is understood as an instrument of oppression and control. So a theologian who starts talking about God is being patriarchal and is using God language to assert power over you and control over you. That's the church. And that's their understanding of the church. And so by definition, then the church is oppressive because it is a conduit for this patriarchal this patriarchal tool of oppression known as God and the Bible and so on and so forth. That begins to enter the realm in the 19th. So we move prior to modernity, or even back in the early 1800s, the Bible was authoritative. God was a creator of all things. Go forward 150 years, both God and the Bible are patriarchal tools, an instrument of patriarchal oppression and control. Male dominated oppression and control. That's what started to happen in the 60s. And that mindset will now make its way as these radicals from the 60s and this mindset from the 60s moves forward into the 70s. These people will then take up positions in universities as professors and researchers and so forth. And they'll get into government and they'll go into journalism and take their place on the editorial board of the New York Times in these places. And they become the mouthpieces for this philosophy, this worldview. That's the march through the institutions. And they will subvert the morality that the pre-modern people stood by for 1,000 years, 1,500 years. That's what started in the 60s. Yeah,
Can you make that page bigger?
I don't know. Can I make this page bigger? Robert, how can I make this page bigger? Isn't there supposed to be like a... Well, I'll just do this. I'll do a slideshow. Forgot how to do a slideshow. So that's that. I should hand this out. I should print this out and give it to you.
Yeah, it's good stuff, but it's the small.
Yeah.
In each of these times, was there not movement or a revival period, like in 70s that you was?
Yeah, you had the Great Awakening in the 1700s, started in New England. You had the student volunteer movement in Great Britain, which was, I don't remember when that was. In the 1800s, you had the revival, Second Great Awakening, revivalist movement, and so forth. Campus Crusade started in 1951, spread out across campuses all over the country. We'll talk about them and what happened to them. But at the end of the day, it's always going to be, those are movements that start and stop. They don't go on forever. The Great Awakening began and ended, and Jonathan Edwards, I think, thought of it as a failure. He gave that sermon 3 times and gave up on it. And then he wrote a book called Religious Affections, which I think was written from the mindset of that failure and what happened to all these people who claim to believe. That's a really good book, but it's also unnerving. It's another book like Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, his sermon that'll make you want to receive Jesus again.
That's Sinners in the Hands of the Angry God, if I remember correctly, when he gave it to his own church, it was kind of like a dud. He went to hear a guest speaker in another church, and the guy was sick, so they asked him to get it to preach. He still had that stuff in his Bible, so he preached it.
Yeah, he just read it off the piece of paper. There was no fancy presentation. He just read it.
He used PowerPoint.
In no PowerPoint. Yeah.
How could they have a Bible without PowerPoint?
So that's the postmodern loss of faith that started really after World War too, but in the sixties, with Vietnam War, I think that was the catalyst. I don't know if it was causal. It was like it was there. That spirit was there and the war just made it spring to life. But, the country, the Western world would never be the same after that happened.
And, each of these periods had a strong influence on theology. Just like in modernism during that period, it influenced the liberalism that started in Germany and flowed out. And then you had different views, like talk about end times. We are what we call pre-millennial here. Then another group of people are amillennial. I have dear friends that are amillennial who are sound and everything else. But and then there used to be post-millennialism. And then post-millennialism, they thought that the world was just getting better and better and better, and by doing that, we're gonna usher in.
We're seeing the kingdom of God realized here on earth.
But then World War I destroyed that.
All gone. Yeah, the fundamentalist movement from the early 1900s. They ain't talking about that stuff after World War I.
Yep.
All right, so that's postmodern loss of faith, which continues to this day. Let's talk about a couple of people. Let's talk about a couple of people. One of the, in the email with Kristen this morning, she listened to the one from 2 weeks ago where I mentioned the Weather Underground. Because, I had the 60s phase in the 90s when I read all this stuff on the 60s radicalism. But one of the things you notice that all those radicals, right? Here it is at the mark, here it is. And right out of the playbook, right? So you had the intersectional feminist movement. This is just the AI. Recognizes how various social identities, such as race, gender, class, and sexuality, intersect and create unique experiences of oppression. There's the privatizing. Unique experiences of oppression and privilege. They're all buzzwords coming into play. Aims to address the complexities of discrimination that individuals face, particularly focused on the experiences of marginalized, just buzzword after buzzword, marginalized groups such as women of color, without defining it, LGBTQ+, which sounds to me like a made-up thing by people who just anoint it as existing. But those are the groups. You can see from the intersectional feminist perspective, the two groups that at the top of the pecking order, and this is probably true of the rainbow flag. I haven't looked at its latest iteration because it keeps changing. The rainbow flag keeps changing. We'll talk about the rainbow eventually. But it's women, specifically marginalized women. Guess who defines who marginalized women are? They do. And then LGBTQ+ individuals. Those are at the top of the pecking order for intersectional feminists. So what happened? We had the second wave feminists. This is still to come from the vantage point of the 60s. The second wave feminists, all this radicalism of the 60s, does its thing, it dies out because it can't continue, partly because the war ended. And once the war ended, you lose your cause, and now it's, and then the civil rights movement had its victory in 1968. Is it 68 with the Civil Rights Act or 64? I don't remember.
I think it was probably before 64. But
So these things happen. It kind of takes the wind out of the sails. So what are they?
You said the war ended, which war?
Vietnam War as a major catalyst for all of this stuff. Yeah.
Refresh my memory, was intersectional feminists, was that men that change themselves to women?
No, that's this right here. That's this movement that I just read right here. It's a movement that recognizes it's a mindset. It's not a set of people. It's the people who espouse this right here. It's this religious, almost pseudo-religious prevailing theology, if you will, or anthropology about the world, however you want to think about it. That's intersectional.
So it's not just feminist meaning women, it's all these other things like the race and the.
Yes, that's exactly right. But at the top of it, pride of place goes to the women. They're the ones, they spring to the top as the most affected, if you will, by patriarchy and, you know, white privilege and these other things.
And that movement would be, is a great tool for ushering in communities. Because it creates division.
Not communism, I don't think. I hear that a lot from people in YouTube. This and that is communist. Yeah, I agree, Marxist,
Okay, Marxist.
but communism is a different thing.
How would you distinguish the difference?
Communism is a program of state control. Marxism is a moral framework, is a moral system, a moral foundation based in the writings of Karl Marx. I mean,
Was it communism inspired by the right?
yes,
Except for,
Yes.
I think Marx would go over his grave when he sees what happened.
but communism, you saw what communism looks like. It looks like Cuba used to look, North Korea, Soviet Union, you know, East Germany. That's communism. So just, you know, you just have, if those words are gonna have meaning, you have to look and see. You can't just say, well, this has some elements of communism, so it's communism. You know, what you can say is that what we see here has a moral foundation based in Marxist principles. And in this case, just remove the idea of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. You remember those terms, even if you don't know what it's a class struggle. That's the classic Marxist paradigm. It's economic. Classic, the class struggle between the people who control the means of production and the laborers who are enslaved to the people that own the means of production. It's a understanding of the serfdom of hundreds of years ago, where you had landowners and then the laborers were basically tied to the landowners because they had no choice. And so I think that's the basis for it. But anyway, the point is, now just get rid of the class idea, the class struggle, and think of struggle like this: oppressor versus oppressed. And so the oppressed people have to rise up and cast off the oppressors. And the oppressors then are the ones who are in control of the systems of supremacy. They're the gatekeepers. So there are these systems of supremacy that favor a particular group. And the systems are designed to benefit those people of this one particular group. And so at the expense of the what they're calling marginalized groups. So this is vintage cultural Marxism right here, in my view. And so that's,
It doesn't define the oppressor, just defines.
it does not, and it wouldn't take, you don't have to hardly look any further to know who the oppressor is in their mindset. They use it right there, women of color,
Yeah.
right? It's embedded. Yeah. What are they marginalized from? And by whom? And the answer is from the patriarchal supremacy of a certain group and so on and so forth. Yeah. That's that's a Marxist paradigm for understanding the world.
Basically, what it comes down to is Marxism is trying to destroy anything that's authority, that has authority in it.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
try to
they will,
read
yeah.
the book. Basically, you try to make everybody equal. And there's nobody in authority,
That would be Marx, that they're eventually,
His system is trying to destroy anything that, any authority.
that's the communist utopia. But from a class struggle standpoint, once you take control of the means of production from the bourgeoisie, some beautiful new world just magically pops into being. And you saw that in that philosophy of mind in the 2020s was the great victory lap for cultural Marxism, where you see in cities like Portland and Seattle and so forth, where they viewed law enforcement as a system of oppression against marginalized groups. Well, if you convince yourself that police cause crime, much like, I mean, it's almost like convincing yourself that, man, every time I see a fire, there's a fireman there. Well, the firemen must cause fires. So we have to get rid of all the firemen. You know, so this side, that's not the same, but it works actually closer with cholesterol as an example, but leave that aside. I don't get an argument about cholesterol. But with law enforcement, once you've convinced yourself that law enforcement is a tool of oppression, that disproportionately impacts marginalized groups, well, what's the answer? Abolition. Abolition.
You know, seems to me that history proves that, you know, you mentioned the oppressor has to, the oppressed has to fight back against the oppressor. When the oppressed conquer the oppressor, they themselves historically
Become the oppressor
oppressors.
at a far greater extent.
Yeah, I mean, go back to Cromwell, right? Puritans were oppressed. Cromwell and the groups overthrew them, and Cromwell became a huge oppressor. You know, the French Revolution. Think
Yeah.
about that.
Then it's unjust and hurting other people.
Right, and it's the same thing happened today.
Yeah.
Where, these so-called, so marginalized groups are now oppressing the church, because the church stands against so much of it.
So here's Black Lives Matter's current about page. Black Lives Matter Foundation is an abolition-centered foundation fighting institutional injustice. We fund organizations in leading policy in abolitionist efforts. What do they mean by abolitionist? Not what the people meant in the 1800s with regard to slavery. Those abolitionists were abolitionists against slavery. What do they mean by, what did these people mean by abolitionists?
Not like heading towards, anarchy.
Law enforcement.
Yeah.
She says it, because this is all run by women. She says it right, let's see.
We divesting in police, prisons and punishment.
Right there. A
Okay.
future fully divested. All punishment paradigms. So this is what the cities gave themselves over to in the summer of 2020. And then they reaped the consequences of this moral anarchy. And now they still they can't get back. What are we gonna do? They cannot get back.
So this is a Marxist philosophy.
Right there. This is textbook cultural Marxist approach, way of approaching the thing. Yeah. So it's creation by destruction. Yeah, you know, there's this, you know what I'm gonna do? There's this oppressive space shuttle at Cape Canaveral. So we're gonna dismantle it. And then we're gonna wait for a beautiful new space shuttle that's even better to take its place. And we're just gonna sit there and watch the pieces on the ground. No, you're gonna watch a bunch of nuts and bolts rust and get weeded over. That's what you're gonna watch. So we'll talk about them in a little bit as well. Again, it's not going well. They did take their victory lap. Their moral framework won, but everybody saw what happened. And the lesson was not lost on anyone. But you think because you control the narrative, if you just tell the story a certain way, mostly peaceful protests. What? I'm watching your news feed, CNN. I'm seeing the guy talking about mostly peaceful protests. There's a burning building behind it.
Mhm.
What? Hey, Gary, don't believe your lying eyes. Listen to my voice.
What does word mostly mean?
I don't know. The guy in, it's Billy Crystal in The Princess Bride. That he's only mostly dead.
Oh, as opposed to the Wizard of Oz, she's not only nearly that, really most sincerely.
That's right. Yeah. So, I'm kind of all over the place right now, but anyway, that's intersectional, intersectionality. Rules the day in the modern gatekeeping framework, moral system, intersectionality. Everything is about, and that's the way they'll talk. Everything is about intersectional victimization, intersectional oppression based on group identity. And depending on, which groups you're a part of, you have oppression points. What somebody once called intersectional Pokemon points. You're this and that and the others. Ooh, got a lot of points of oppression. So usually you just get celebrated more in this weird world where oppression is celebrated. Anyway, back to the 70s. Before all this, we have second wave feminism, and they move now into the universities and so forth, and so do the radicals. The feminists were not violent. I mean, they were advocates. They marched in the streets and stuff like that. But back then, the marches in the streets were just that. They were marches. That's another thing that changed, which maybe we can talk about. But so these radicals moved out into the universities, and they lost their way in the 60s, and some of them didn't give up. And you then saw an organization like the Weather Underground, which is what me and Chris were talking about this morning. The Weather Underground, which was this holdover thing that got designated a terrorist group in the 1970s, and I think both of its leaders, Bernadine Dorn and Bill Ayers, founders, ended up on the FBI's most wanted list. At least Bernadine Dorn did, and they can thank God that they can thank the God that they don't believe in, that they were so incompetent as terrorists. Otherwise, they might have actually killed somebody. But I think the only people they ever killed were their own when a bomb that they were making detonated in a basement somewhere or something while they were making it. I don't know. But anyway, I think she did some time in prison. What happened to Bernadine Dorn? Let's go back to the grift. What did I say? Well, the intersectional feminist movement turns into, even before it, it's really the Marxist movement, cultural Marxist movement, turns into the grift. And the grift then, in the grift, you move from advocacy, like in the 60s, to an ideology develops out of it. You start out with the, speaking against the oppression of something, and then that becomes an ideology. And then that ideology turns into an activism. And then that activism, when it wins, like it did, it turns into an orthodoxy. So this orthodoxy spreads out, this activism spreads out into the universities and becomes an orthodoxy in these universities. And all these departments are affected by it, humanities and so on and so forth, so that we don't recognize them today. And that orthodoxy then, after it wins, becomes bureaucratized. And then after it becomes a bureaucracy, let the grift begin. As the original activists and advocates now can profit off of the bureaucracy that they themselves are responsible for creating. And so one of those was Bernadine Dorn, who found herself on the FBI's 10 most wanted list in the 1970s, went to the University of Chicago and got into the grift and became a professor and all that stuff, and a celebrated writer and so on and so forth, and experienced every benefit she possibly could off of the advocacy and the activism that she started with. That's the grift, every single time. Her husband, Bill Ayers, who is the co-founder, is a top consultant and contact with the biggest personalities of one of the parties. You don't do that and be poor.
So she's not in jail.
No, I think she went to jail on the 7th. But that's the grift. That's all it is. It's just a grift. You can have all kinds of fancy words as much as you want, like that. That sounds beautiful. The people who believe this and write about it, they're all in universities making 100 and some odd or more thousand a year as tenured professors and getting adored. And when they have come on to news shows like, whatever show, writing in the New York Times and so forth, that's the grift, just a grift. And the grift has entered the church. Has it not? Let's see, what am I missing before we get there? Let's talk about this. The war on the church. I mean, the war on Genesis 1 and 2. No, let's do the church first. Let's do that later because we got to finish the story. But besides, I keep saying that I'm going to talk about today. All right, so we went from here, here. Postmodern loss of faith in the 60s and the 50s probably. But things have changed as third wave feminism, as feminism has devolved. You would think that it couldn't get worse than what you were seeing in the 60s and 70s, but it can.
You can do the slideshow.
Oh yeah, do the slideshow, sorry.
Thank you.
So we move from postmodern, pessimistic, pseudo-spiritual, anti-scientific loss of faith in modernity and science and all that kind of stuff to deconstruction, where we are now going to dismantle systems of oppression. And what's one of the great ironies of dismantling the systems of oppression is that the people who run the cities where supposedly these systems of oppression exist are themselves people who believe this. So the people marching in the street against the people, the oppressors, are marching against the people who in control believe like they do. There ain't no conservatives in Portland or Seattle running them cities. So I don't know who these anarchists are marching against in Portland on the streets and burning down the city, but it ain't, there's no conservatives to march against. It's all people that think like they do. You cannot do enough to please these people, but nobody ever figures that out. And so what you end up with then is a philosophy and a mindset of deconstruction, which ends up turning violent because you have no limits, you have no constraints, you have nothing that says this far and no farther. It's a by any means necessary approach, moral philosophy. By any means necessary, the ends justify the means. That's Marxist. The ends justify the, what do you mean by any means necessary? You think it's this noble statement, by any means necessary. Well, here's what you mean. I reserve for myself the right to do anything in the achievement of my goal, because I've convinced myself that morality is the end product. In a more just world, a more equitable world is the moral thing, and anything I have to do to achieve that, I'm justified in doing. The ends justify the means. That's Marxist and Leninist and so on and so forth. But that's not how morality works. Morality says not, my end is moral. Whatever my end is the moral thing. Morality is the series, is the constraints you place on yourself in the pursuit of your ends. This far and no farther. I want my end, but I'm not going any farther than this. I'm not going to burn somebody's house down for it. For example. That's morality. That doesn't exist in this cultural Marxist framework. There are no constraints. So of course, this is what ends up happening. So now in 2020, let's go all the way, 2025, starting, I've said at this point in my life, 3 weeks ago or a month ago or 2 months ago, early 2000s, because I don't know, sometime between 2008 and 16, God is a tool of power, Bible is a tool of power, church and state, well, we're going to infiltrate the church. We're going to infiltrate the church and take it over. That's what we're going to do. Morality, ends justified, Marxist, Science, tool of power, just like God. How do you like that, scientists? Kind of wish you had them Christians back, those crazy Christian creationists, don't you? Those are the good old days, weren't they? You could sit in a room, you could sit up on a stage and politely and peacefully in an orderly manner debate the existence of God or evolution versus creation, and everybody would just sit there and listen. Go ahead and try that now. Yeah. A lot of people changing their minds about those Christians, man, things were pretty good when we only had them to deal with. That's Richard Dawkins. He calls himself a cultural Christian now. He doesn't believe a word of it, but he wants the culture to be Christian. No, Richard, it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. It's not how it works. You know, have a whole nation that fakes it. Doesn't work like that. Prevailing narrative, oppressor versus oppressed. You should already know now what I'm talking about when I say that. So we move from here, Middle Ages. Man is created in the image of God, and we are a product of his creation, and so on and so forth. The Declaration of Independence is an extension of that in the course that God created all men equal, that they are endowed by their creator with. That's just an extension of that mindset. Then we move into a narrative, a subversion of all narratives. Well, what happens when you subvert all narratives? Well, now you leave the ground wide open. You've conceded all the territory. This is what enters. And what enters is group identity, oppressor versus oppressed, an intersectional approach to understanding humans, which means it's all about oppression, period. That's where we are. And then this is what will infiltrate the church. Did that make sense? How are we doing? That's a lot of stuff.
A lot of stuff.
Is there not now a pushback against them?
Yeah, that's the one on top that you don't see up there.
No.
What's that? What's that?
It's the grant, they're trying to hurry you along.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of like the church and state, like our government does the opposite of what our constitution said. The government's not supposed to put authority over the church, but they've made it so that the church can't put authority over the government.
So when the government says, think about the inherent, what's potentially the fatal weakness of the government shall make no law establishing a religion? What's potentially the fatal weakness of that? You leave the territory wide open.
Yes.
Whoever has the most fervency and the most power and is the most clever and the most ruthless, it's the survival of the unfittest. Whoever is the most ruthless and the most immoral and the most diabolical and the most dishonest, those are the ones who win.
That's why we give the 501c to Satan worship in America. We allow that.
They don't care about the Constitution. So, well, I don't want to get into the Constitution because I have a lot to say about that too. Anyway, this is still going on. We're in a time now when there's this fight going on between the two, between something and something else. And this is one side of it. And they're not happy because they've had to concede territory. They've had no choice in the matter. And so we'll get back to that. That's for next week. But let me just go through the grift in the last couple minutes. I told you you're going to get tired of hearing about the grift. So that's the Marxist movement, intersectional feminist, which is the intersectional feminist movement is a Marxist movement. So is Black Lives Matter, the Marxist movement. We'll get back to that. This is the grift, and this is where we're at. And the grift is now in big, big trouble because of a Supreme Court ruling a couple of years ago with regard to affirmative action. Nobody saw it coming. The implications of overturning, ending affirmative action. So we'll talk about the consequence of that later. Let me see if I want to talk about, let's just introduce the church now. What has this to do with the church? With the church, you have these almost exclusively intersectional feminists now target the church. They identify a target, they infiltrate, they subvert, and then they then they capture. And through this process of capture, then they are able to take over. And then at that point, cleansing of what they deem as heretics, oftentimes through public shaming. Public shaming is the great tool that cultural Marxism uses to get its way. Public shaming in every realm. That's why apologies don't work. They want the apology so they can parade around the scalp, but they're not going to forgive you. It's a pseudo religion. And we'll talk about this maybe over the next 2 weeks. There's only 2 weeks to go. What this pseudo religion mimics Christianity, mimics a religion in Christianity in many ways. But the one thing it does not have is any idea of redemption or forgiveness. It's not in there. It's on the contrary. It's puritanical, as they understood falsely Puritanism. They want the confession so they can parade you around, not so they can forgive you. We demand an apology, so you apologize. They scream louder. You issue another apology. They scream louder. You issue another apology. So Babylon B does a satire about, what's the guy, Phil, the quarterback, when he had to do this.
Sure.
No, the quarterback, the really good, the Purdue quarterback that was so good. Not Phil, not, huh? No, that's Florida. Huh? No. Was it Drew Brees? Might have been Drew Brees. Where he kept apologizing because he said something and they kept not accepting the apology. And then Babylon B wrote an article about Drew Brees apologizing for the 708th time. You know, will it be numbers? Maybe at 709. If I just apologize one more time, maybe. No, it doesn't work like that. It's not what it's for. That's Marxist. It's a show trial. That's how they work. These show trials in the 30s, Stalinist show trials, weren't to forgive anybody. They want the world to hear the confession, then they'll execute you. Oh, you're guilty. Your punishment is death. That's the point of a show trial. And that's the Marxist paradigm. So this is where we'll pick up. We'll talk about this right here and what's happened particularly, well, in the first place with the Episcopalian Church, the Episcopal Church. It says Anglican, but the Episcopal Church is the Anglican Church in the United States. And what's happened to the Episcopal Church, and particularly, here's a great example of it, the Washington Cathedral. We'll talk about this if you know what the Washington Cathedral is. We'll talk, but this is where we'll go now, and how these churches have been captured. Not just churches, whole denominations have been captured by this intersectional feminist Marxist framework. All right, that's all. I got to stop. It's 10:17. Thanks for joining, Kay, Naomi.
Thank you, Gary.
There's,
Thank you, Gary.
See ya.
Y'all have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.